all of you who are interested. You can find a lot of information about this on the internet, and you can ask me as well. Okay, another example is the so-called cooperative networks of microenterprises, which promote peer-to-peer exchanges, peer-to-peer productions, and also the engagement of micro-entrepreneurs in community empowerment. This fine lady here, Elsa, a good friend of mine and a mentor whom I met doing field work in a shanty town in Rio de Janeiro, is here proudly showing one of her products with Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president. This bag was produced by a group of seamstresses that she worked with, and it actually represents, it values and cultivates the local culture of women of color from shanty towns, and represents the beauty and the vibrancy of shantytown culture in Rio de Janeiro. And this is based on those peer-to-peer exchanges, exchange of knowledge, exchange of materials, buying and selling from each other, and then to the overall market. I have a set of conclusions which could already be induced from what I've just presented. What can urban movements in places like London and other places learn from these experiences? Okay. An alternative economic pedagogy that promotes alternatives to the apparatus developed by capitalism, both material and symbolic. A holistic and inductive integrated methodology for economic planning and development. And also an emancipatory and pluralistic form of communitarism that can represent a viable alternative to very dangerous trends that one can notice in marginalized communities. And now the question remains, can these methodologies be applied, in the core of society, among the middle class? Can middle class individualism be transcended? If so, how can we make this appealing to the middle classes in Europe, North America, and in other parts of the so-called industrialized world? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. There you go.
And, if everyone would like to join Andreas up front.
Hello.
Okay, we have 10 minutes before we have the speaker setting. Thank you all. I'm not quite sure where to start. With the audience, if there are any questions already. I think there were two good examples of situated knowledge that goes from within. And in a way, I'd like to hear the reverse take on it a bit more, because I think you're positioning yourself slightly different with hello? Yeah. As a practice, you're not necessarily situated, but you work to try to mediate, so understand situated knowledge and both the kind of top-down structure. So, in a way, I'm curious to see. I'm not quite sure what I'm curious to see. Now, how do we mediate these practices? Because I think there's meaning and relevance in both of them. And how do we mobilize them again? It comes back to the conclusion about this middle class aspiration, middle class, kind of the visions of livelihoods we create. And how do we reach that? And how do we reach that both through the bottom up in a way, and how do we instrumentalize the other tools at hand in a way?
I'm really sorry. This might not fully answer your question, but it's a start. I'm really intrigued by what you mentioned right at the beginning and right at the end of your talk, which is at the end that very question: how can middle class individualism be transcended? And at the beginning, you mentioned that that every economic structure is inevitably a pedagogical structure. Yeah. And I think that's true because what we're now starting to see in certain communities, and a large part of Rotterdam that I'm thinking of in particular, is that I guess in a perhaps less clearly the political, ideological way, as some of the examples you mentioned. I think that people in the Netherlands and in the UK, by and large, are scared of words like a sentence or a paragraph with the word capitalism mentioned too often scares a lot of people off. Solidarity. Ooh, I'm not sure if I want to go that far, but I'm interested in doing stuff together with my neighbours. Right? And I think there's a kind of post-ideological pragmatism that rules kind of subconsciousness, and within that, I think what you see is that in a neighbourhood where there's a fair number of civic entrepreneurial projects happening, at some point there can very well be a trigger point where the threshold to starting the next one becomes radically lower, and that's really interesting. And so this is not from a kind of, I was a bit worried when you said economic planning by bottom, because I think it's not planning, right? It is momentum. Speaking of a funny term, but it's a type of momentum where you all of a sudden see that the plausibility of the next project is increasing, and the ever denser networks of people knowing each other and being able to ask for favors start enabling this. And so what you're seeing is this is not exclusively based on working classes or on middle classes. In fact, I think the very word class is something that, again, people are scared of. But it transcends that. And it's about pragmatism, and it's about fun, and it's about use value, right? Definitely. So I think you see it happening there, and I think that also puts us as professionals in a very important spot, or a difficult spot, which is not just riding the waves of where it does happen, but also questioning where it doesn't and what should be done and what can be done to propel these things in areas that are perhaps less obvious. Which I think is what a lot of 00's work is about. Like, how can you actually become part of a local situation, make yourself useful, offer your tools in a fairly humble way to latent potential already out there, whether that's in Loughborough Junction or elsewhere, and that's what we're trying to do. So I guess that's the beginning of an answer.
We have a question. Pablo, sorry.
Thanks for the amazing talks. I was excited about what Ana Margarita you said about understanding this bon vivir andino, el bon vivir, no? As a kind of form of futurism. But I think it's for Europe, it's an amazing kind of talk that we can have. But my question is more precise, and it's about the metrics. Because both metrics, because both of you used, and you didn't use metrics, but I think you work with metrics as well, but where those metrics come from? I mean, about this pro-commons, solidarity economy, are you using metrics that comes from, let's say, Ostrom kind of research groups, or where are those pools of metrics that you are using to get into this metadata about this solidarity economy or commons? I mean, where are those metrics?
Okay, regarding the metrics, okay, in my research I use mainly the data, the statistical data that was gathered by SENAIS, the Brazilian Secretariado Nacional de Economia Solidária. The first survey was done in 2007, and then there was another one in 2011. But during my research, I used mainly an ethnographic approach. So I used those statistics as a kind of background in my PhD thesis and then in my articles, just to give an idea of how the field looks like, the dimensions and the characteristics of solidarity economy as a field. But then I used mainly a kind of, a kind of hermeneutical approach to understand from the perspective of the people I was working with, how they understand their everyday life and how they construct, co-construct, and are co-constructed by it. So that's where the metrics come from. The statistical part comes from data which was produced by the Solidarity Economy Forums with the support of SNIs. And then the theoretical, the theoretical wrapping of my ethnographic research comes mainly from authors like Marcos Arruda, Euclides André Manse, also Coraggio from Argentina, Jean-Louis Laville from France, who's very much influenced by the Latin American approach, and also by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. I hope this answers your question in what regards my presentation.
Can I go? My question is for Anthea, and it's based on a point that for Anthea, but it's based on a point that Anna raised, which is about use value, I wonder how you negotiate in your position as the Loughborough Farm. So how do you negotiate? How do you manage to show different kind of values? So obviously, like the existing. One thing that we struggle with in Deptford is trying to convince a local authority that there are other values besides economic value of kind of land. And I was wondering if you have examples of how like you've managed to illustrate, for instance, social value or other values.
Well, I think it's probably the case that the Loughborough Farm did kind of establish itself as an asset of community value. And I think as a result of that, it's not easy to do. It did require a lot of work, and I think the success of the project is that it's been extremely consistent. People have always known that if we've said we're open, we are open. So there has always been that kind of consistency, and I think that is something that was able for us to demonstrate to the council that we had established something of social value. And that made them very frightened about, well, let's not say very frightened. It made them a bit apprehensive about taking this asset away. And this asset was, technically, it was not a particularly valuable piece of land to Lambeth Council because it had a use class order, which meant that it could only be used for industrial. However, they could have always lifted that. They could have always lifted that designation. It was never, ever set in stone. And so there certainly, I think, was a point where they could have lifted the designation and sold the land for housing. But in fact, the council, to their credit, did not do that. But and they went to the GL, and there was no way that they could have developed the land without a public subsidy. It was commercially failing as a piece of land. So so in the long term, there would have been an incentive to have lifted the industrial use class on it and put it over to housing. But to their credit, they did actually look at ways of getting public subsidy into the land to develop it as affordable workspace for local people and a permanent home rather than a meanwhile home for the Loughborough Farm. So in some ways we hope that that is a win-win situation, but the proof will be in the pudding, to be honest.
Just to say very quickly on some metrics and data, I think it's a multifaceted story again, because I think Loughborough Farm illustrates it well. On the one hand, unfortunately, a lot of great civic projects, by which in this case I don't mean Loughborough Farm, don't succeed in telling their story in an effective way towards the powers that be. So obviously data tracking, and obviously it sounds like you've done a very good job, but in general, data tracking and linking activities to outcomes, to bigger agendas, etc., is not something that a lot of civic entrepreneurs and initiators have the patience and the mindset for. I think a lot of great practice is made very vulnerable by the fact that that doesn't happen often enough. On the other hand, of course, let's not fool ourselves and think that the kind of civic economy is a post-political world, because it isn't. Despite there being many great instances of collaboration between public sector and civic entrepreneurs, political decision makers respond really well to political pressure, and so you can come up with the data and the evidence and the carefully thought through causal sequences as much as you like, but sometimes if you don't have the mass political backing, which in the case of I think Loughborough Farm it clearly did have, and that's been its savior, you still lose. Politicians might wipe something out at a stroke of a pen if it's not politically significant enough, no matter what great evidence exists. Take Sure Start, for example, just to mention one. So again, on data and metrics, it's incredibly important. If we're going to go to sort of outcomes-based finance, etc., we can't do without it. But in the real world, hard political dogfights will still be incredibly important.
More questions from the floor? Thomas, as you were called earlier.
Sounds very official. So my questions, Joost, is my question, I guess, comes from this idea from what you're talking about with Brixton Village, how it started from something great, lots of energy, and then somehow got subverted into a consumption-based model and, I guess, monetized. And it's something that we question a lot with the Loughborough Farm. I question from both as a volunteer with the farm and also involved in the new scheme, is that how we kind of set up these safeguards so that when the civic society creates something special, it remains special rather than just being turned into something that can be monetized. And if you know of any models that can safeguard.
Well, that's the thing. We've got a lot. In that sense, we've got, I think, a lot to learn from perhaps Southern Europe and Latin America, where some of the fundamentals have never been lost out of sight. Right? Ownership is power. Let's be very clear about it. Unless you co-own some of these or own some of these civic assets, they're not safe. And I say that also as someone who runs a series of social enterprise workspaces, which are made incredibly vulnerable by the fact that we don't own any of them. And that is an experience that is replicated across this, in this case, global network of workspaces. No matter how good your business model, if you can't get good lease terms in a world in which real estate, no matter who you talk to in Prague or in small provincial Czech cities or anywhere in the world, as well as in London, right? Real estate markets are out of control. Therefore, unless you are really astute about that, you make yourself very vulnerable. That's what went wrong in Brixton Village in a major way. Hopefully, I think in Loughborough Farm you have a chance to get it right. And that's to do with governance.
I'd like to kind of add something to that. Our experience working in our community has kind of, I find myself asking quite a lot of questions. For example, I'm a kind of white, middle-class, entitled woman, and I have to make sure, I have to put myself in my shoes and see how people see me and experience me, and which is obviously a challenge. And we talk about LJAG. We do believe in placemaking, but something that has really struck us in all the conversations that we have with people around our neighbourhood, and there is an element that our neighbourhood has become a bit like is much more connected than it was. But the idea of doing anything in a neighbourhood, anything, engenders such fear currently within London, such fear that in a forgotten neighbourhood like Loughborough Junction, people are almost grateful to be forgotten, because if they're forgotten, no one is going to interfere with them. And so in some ways, even our ideas of improving the public realm, because I personally believe that everyone deserves good public realm, but even the idea of improving the public realm engenders fear within people. What? Fear of gentrification, fear of being pushed out of a neighborhood, fear that, you know, even if you're a council tenant, your estate may be regenerated, you may be pushed out by higher rents. These are all things that, I mean, any kind of improvement, they don't necessarily, people are conflicted about. There is conflict over it. We have, and also communication in a diverse community is so complex, so complex. I've had 2 conversations in the last week with people that have really kind of brought me up short. On the whole, we put out really well-designed leaflets and leaflets and posters and things. And I ran into a young man who lives in my street yesterday, in fact, and he is thinking of starting a food business. And I knew this, and I said, "Well, are you coming to the meeting on Monday about LJ Works? You're just the kind of person that could benefit from this project." He said, "What?" He lives round the corner from this project. He said, "What? What are you talking about?" And I led him over to a poster that was on the wall. And he said to me, "I would never have read that." So he said, "You're not communicating in a way that I would not have read that poster." So he said, "If you gave me the tools, I would design you a poster that would be read by people like me." So this is a really important lesson, and I don't always like hearing it, to be honest, because I love our prettily designed posters, but we're not talking to, in some ways, we're not talking to the people that we need to talk to, or talk with, not to, with.
Maybe that's a really nice moment to end, isn't it? So I want to thank you, panel. We lost Joost to his child. Yes, please.
Because we grow food, and because I have some seeds here. So I have some seeds here, and they're pea seeds. So if anyone would like to take a pea seed home with them and plant it, and grow something, and even start something in your community with this one small seed, please come and see me and I'll give you a seed.
One final thing is on Saturday, myself and Andy will be giving tours of both the Loughborough Farm, which I'll be giving, and of the Old Tide Mill Wildlife Garden, which Andy will be doing. So there's leaflets outside. Pardon? And a sign-up sheet. So if you're interested to come and see some of these sites, just put your name down and we'll email out details. There's also leaflets. I think the one in Loughborough Junction starts at 1 o'clock and what time? And 12 o'clock for Deptford.
And there's a bar downstairs.